Resident Evil Escape Raccoon City. Broken City Rising by Sarah Nong. Heavyweight champion of nothing, Paul Winters was losing. Not in the ring. In life. At 27, he had a professional boxing record that read like a warning label. Promising amateur career, disappointing pro climb, 3 losses by decision, 1 brutal TKO 6 months ago. He stood in his apartment kitchen staring at an unpaid electricity bill while ice melted over bruised knuckles. The TV droned behind him. Reports of violent disturbances near downtown Raccoon City. He muted it. He didn't care about street fights. He had his own. Through the thin apartment wall, he heard movement next door. Boots, metal clinks, gun parts. He smiled faintly. Jill. He'd rehearsed conversations with her 100 times in his head, never actually had one. He stepped into the hallway at the same moment her door opened. She wore tactical gear, shoulder holster, focused expression. "You heading out?" He asked casually. She nodded once. "Something's wrong in the city." Before he could respond, the building shook violently. A thunderous explosion blew out windows at the far end of the hallway. Concrete dust filled the air. Then, heavy footsteps echoed up the stairwell. Not human. Deliberate. Metal grinding. Jill's expression shifted instantly from alert to lethal. She drew her handgun. The stairwell door exploded inward, and it stepped through. Tall. Massive. Wrapped in black leather and industrial restraints. One glowing eye scanning. Breathing like a furnace. Stars. Paul's blood ran cold. Jill fired immediately. Bullets struck its chest with no visible effect. The monster advanced. Paul didn't think. He grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and hurled it at the creature's head. It barely flinched. Jill grabbed Paul's arm. "Move!" They sprinted down the opposite hallway. The monster smashed through doors instead of using them. It wasn't chasing randomly. It wanted her. They burst into her apartment. Jill overturned her kitchen table to block the doorway and shoved a shotgun into Paul's hands. "You ever fired one?" "Yes." "Good." The Nemesis smashed through the wall like paper. Paul fired instinctively. The blast rocked his shoulder. The creature staggered half a step. Half. Jill hurled a grenade from her vest. "Down!" Explosion. The apartment filled with smoke and flame. The Nemesis roared. Paul's ears rang. Jill grabbed him again. "Balcony!" They leapt onto the fire escape. The metal ladder rattled violently as they descended. Behind them, the Nemesis walked through fire. Unaffected. Reaching. "Run!" Jill yelled. They hit the alley and split instinctively in opposite directions to confuse pursuit. Paul ran, adrenaline pumping. Behind him, a rocket streaked down the alley and exploded against a dumpster. The Nemesis had a launcher. Paul didn't look back again. He ran into the streets of a dying city. The long walk home. Zombies flooded intersections. Burning cars blocked traffic. Gunshots echoed from rooftops. Paul ducked into a sporting goods store and grabbed the first weapon he found. A Louisville Slugger. It felt natural in his hands. Balanced. Solid. A zombie staggered toward him inside the store. He stepped forward instinctively. Left hook motion. The bat cracked against its temple. Skull caved in. The body dropped. Paul stared at it. That wasn't a knockout. That was death. Outside, screams filled the air. He ran toward his family home across town, every block worse than the last. He saw a man devoured by infected dogs, a woman thrown through a shop window, a police cruiser overturned and burning, and high above, umbrella helicopters circling. He reached his childhood street just as dusk bled across the sky. The house door hung open. Paul stepped inside slowly. "Mom? Dad?" Wet chewing sounds answered him. He moved toward the kitchen and froze. His father knelt over his mother's body, biting into her neck. Blood poured across the tile. Paul's stomach dropped. "Dad." The figure turned. Eyes dead, mouth red. It lunged. Paul reacted. The bat swung with everything he had left. It connected with a sickening crunch. Again, again, again. His father's skull collapsed under repeated blows. The body finally stopped moving. Paul dropped the bat. He fell to his knees beside his mother. She was still alive. Barely. Her eyes focused weakly on him. "Paul, I'm here." "Find Brian." She coughed blood. Deborah's house. Her hand went limp. Paul sat there for a moment, everything inside him hollow. Then something hardened. He stood, picked up the bat, and left the house without looking back. Meanwhile, Deborah's bedroom. Brian Winters stood in the doorway, watching. Jonathan and Deborah tangled in sheets. Silence. Then, "What the hell?" Brian whispered. Jonathan scrambled upright. "Brian." Brian lunged at him. The fight was immediate and brutal. Punches thrown without form. Rage. Jonathan landed a shot to Brian's jaw. Brian tackled him into a dresser. Deborah screamed, "Stop!" Glass shattered. Not from the fight, from outside. A liquor crashed through the bedroom window. It landed between them, tongue whipping. Brian froze. Jonathan stared. Deborah screamed again. The creature lunged. Claws tore across Jonathan's shoulder. He fell backward, bleeding. Brian grabbed a desk lamp and smashed it uselessly against the creature's head. It turned toward him, just as the bedroom door exploded inward. Paul Winters charged in. He swung the bat full force into the liquor's exposed brain. The first hit stunned it. The second caved in part of its skull. The third crushed through entirely. It collapsed in a heap of twitching muscle. Silence. Heavy breathing. Paul looked at Brian. "They're dead," he said flatly. Brian understood instantly. Deborah stared at the corpse. Jonathan clutched his bleeding shoulder. Paul raised the bat again, not at him, but in warning. "We're leaving, now." Sirens wailed in the distance. The city was falling. And this was only the beginning. The liquor's corpse twitched one last time before going still. The bedroom smelled like copper and splintered wood. Curtains fluttered inward through the shattered window, carrying smoke from distant fires. Paul stood over the creature, chest heaving, Louisville slugger dripping black-red gore. Brian stared at his older brother like he'd never seen him before. Jonathan pressed a towel against his torn shoulder, blood seeping through quickly. Deborah's mascara had run down her cheeks. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the world outside reminded them. Gunfire, screams, sirens abruptly cutting off mid-wail. Paul broke the silence. "Grab what you need. We're leaving." Brian swallowed hard. "Mom?" Paul didn't soften it. "Dad killed her. I stopped him." The words hit like bricks. Deborah covered her mouth. Jonathan looked away. Brian's face went pale, but something in him changed instantly. Shock burned into focus. "We can't stay here," Brian said quietly. Paul nodded once. Deborah wiped her face and spoke in a trembling voice. "My dad has guns in the basement. He doesn't trust banks." Paul looked at her sharply. "How many?" "Enough." "Show me." The weapon cache. The basement smelled of dust and oil. Deborah unlocked a reinforced cabinet behind stacked boxes of holiday decorations. Inside, Desert Eagle 50 AE, 3 Glock 19s, Mossberg 590 shotgun, several boxes of 9mm, 2 boxes of 50 AE, 5 boxes of 12-gauge shells. Paul whistled low. Jonathan winced while rewrapping his shoulder. "You're not turning, right?" Brian asked him bluntly. Jonathan glared. "It scratched me, not bit." Paul examined the wound closely. Deep, but clean. No gray discoloration yet. "We watch him," Paul said. Jonathan didn't argue. Deborah loaded one Glock awkwardly. Her hands shook. Brian picked up another Glock with surprising confidence. "I go to the range with Dad," he said. Paul handed him 2 spare magazines. "You stay behind me." Outside, something heavy slammed into the front door upstairs. Everyone froze. Another slam. The wood splintered. Paul racked the Mossberg. Time to test them. First Street ambush. The front door burst inward. 3 zombies stumbled into the hallway. Jonathan fired too quickly. Missed twice. Hit the chest. Paul stepped forward and fired the shotgun. The blast tore through 2 skulls at once. Deborah screamed and fired blindly. Brian grabbed her arm. Headshots! The third zombie lunged toward Jonathan. Brian shot it cleanly through the eye. It dropped instantly. Silence fell again. Paul nodded at Brian. Good shot. Brian swallowed but held eye contact. Outside, more shapes moved down the street. They exited through the backyard instead. Smoke rolled over rooftops now. Raccoon City was losing. Minor death. Mrs. Callahan. As they moved through neighboring yards, an elderly woman emerged from a garden shed. "Help me!" she cried. Before Paul could respond, an infected dog barreled into her from behind. It ripped into her calf, pulling her down. Paul aimed, too late. The dog tore open her throat. Blood sprayed across white siding. Paul fired once. The dog collapsed. The woman gurgled, eyes fading. Deborah sobbed quietly. Brian stared coldly. Paul exhaled slowly. Keep moving. The city wasn't stopping for anyone. Eastbound. The streets toward the East Evacuation Center were worse than West had been. Cars jammed bumper to bumper. People running. People trampling each other. Paul saw a father crushed beneath a crowd trying to protect his son. He couldn't save them all. He stopped trying. Then, gunfire erupted from ahead. Uniformed mercenaries fired into advancing hordes. Umbrella patches visible. UBCS. One of them shouted through a megaphone, "Evacuation point closed! Retreat!" Closed? Paul pushed forward through the chaos. They reached the East Civic Plaza and saw the truth. Helicopters lifting off, leaving, buses overturned, zombies flooding the barricades, hunters leaping from rooftops. A woman was cut in half mid-run by a hunter's claw. Jonathan froze. Paul grabbed him by the collar and dragged him behind a concrete divider. Brian fired carefully. One hunter fell. Another leapt over a bus and landed in the middle of fleeing civilians. Carnage. Absolute carnage. A biker in leather shoved past them carrying a sawed-off shotgun. "Evac's done," he yelled. "City's dead." That was Dylan Reed. Behind him stumbled a middle-aged woman clutching a grocery bag like it mattered. Helen White. Dylan fired both barrels into a zombie's face. "Find another way out," he shouted. Paul moved closer. "You know one?" Dylan looked him up and down. "You got a better idea, Boxer?" Paul blinked. "How do you?" "You're on posters downtown." Paul ignored it. Helen spoke up breathlessly. "There's a service road north. Forest route, past the old Spencer estate. Goes beyond the Arklay Mountains." Paul's eyes narrowed. "Why do you know that?" She hesitated. "I've lived here 40 years. Another explosion rocked the plaza. The evacuation was completely lost. Hunters tore through the last defensive line. Dylan reloaded quickly. "Talking's done. We move north, or we die here." Paul looked at Brian, then at Deborah and Jonathan, then back toward the rising smoke of downtown. He made the call. North. Street gauntlet. The combined group moved through alleyways to avoid main roads. Minor fight after minor fight. 2 zombies pinned Brian. Paul crushed their skulls with the bat. Deborah froze during a close encounter. Helen shot the zombie first. Jonathan nearly shot Dylan in panic. Dylan knocked him flat and warned him once. Trust was thin. The sun dipped lower. Sirens had mostly stopped. The city was entering full collapse. High above, a massive figure moved between rooftops. Watching. The Nemesis. Tracking. Tension. They ducked into an abandoned laundromat briefly. Jonathan leaned against a washer, sweating. Brian watched him carefully. "You feel sick?" "No." "Fever?" "No." Paul stepped between them. "Enough." Dylan leaned against the wall casually. "You all related?" Paul nodded toward Brian. "My brother." Dylan smirked faintly. "Family makes people do stupid, brave things." Helen sat quietly, hands shaking. Paul noticed something odd. She kept checking her purse. Protectively, he filed that away. Ha! Cliffhanger. As they stepped back into the alley, a shadow fell across them. Heavy boots hit pavement. Slow, deliberate. Stars! Paul's blood froze. The Nemesis stood at the alley mouth. Rocket launcher raised. Its single eye locked on Jill's last known proximity, and now found Paul instead. It fired. The rocket streaked toward them, and the chapter ends in white flame. The rocket struck the pavement 5 feet in front of them. White light swallowed the alley. Then heat. Then impact. The explosion hurled bodies in every direction. Concrete shattered. Brick walls split. Windows imploded inward from the shockwave. Paul felt himself lifted off his feet and slammed through a stack of trash bins. His ears rang with a high-pitched scream that might have been Deborah, or just the sound of his own ruptured equilibrium. Smoke rolled thick and suffocating through the alley. For a moment there was nothing but dust and ringing silence. Then, coughing, crying, gunfire. Paul forced himself upright. Brian lay 10 feet away, dazed but alive. Deborah crawled from beneath a dented metal door. Jonathan groaned, clutching his shoulder again. Helen was on her side, purse still clutched tightly to her chest. Dylan was already up, firing down the alley. "Move!" Dylan shouted. The Nemesis stepped through the smoke. Unaffected. Rocket launcher resting calmly on its shoulder. Its glowing eye scanned through debris. Target reacquired. Paul grabbed Brian by the collar and shoved him toward a side exit. "Garage!" Dylan yelled. "Parking structure ahead." Another rocket streaked down the alley. Paul tackled Helen and Deborah through a broken service door just as the explosion tore the alley apart again. Flames roared behind them. Parking garage massacre. They stumbled into a multi-level concrete parking garage lit by flickering fluorescent strips. Cars sat abandoned at odd angles, blood smeared across pillars. Bodies littered the ramps. A security guard lay half inside a booth, head missing. Paul slammed the metal door shut behind them and jammed a pipe through the handles. It wouldn't stop the Nemesis long. They moved up the ramp cautiously. Then the moans began. Zombies staggered between vehicles. Some trapped in seatbelts, some chewing on bodies in driver's seats. Dylan fired first. Clean headshot. Brian followed. Deborah steadied her breathing and shot one through the temple. Jonathan hesitated when a teenage girl in prom dress stumbled toward him. Paul didn't. The bat cracked skull. The girl dropped. Jonathan stared. That could have been us. Paul didn't respond. A hunter suddenly vaulted down from the second level. It landed in the center lane and roared. The echo magnified its shriek painfully. Dylan didn't waste time. He ducked under its first swipe and shoved the sawed-off into its abdomen. Boom! The blast tore into muscle. It swung wildly and clipped him across the chest, tearing leather. Brian fired twice into its eye socket. Paul rushed forward and drove the bat into its jaw hinge with full rotational force. The jaw shattered sideways. Deborah screamed and emptied her Glock into its skull. It finally dropped. Silence again. They were learning. Fast. Minor death, Mr. Halpern. From the third level, an older man waved frantically. Up here, please! They hurried toward him, owner of the downtown hardware store. He clutched a crowbar and limped badly. Thank God, he breathed. I've been hiding since morning. Behind him, a car alarm suddenly blared. The noise echoed horribly through the garage. Paul's head snapped toward the sound. Too late. 2 lickers dropped from the ceiling beams above. One landed directly on Mr. Halpern. Claws punched through his shoulders and pinned him to the concrete. He screamed once before the tongue shot through his skull. Jonathan fired wildly. Missed. The second licker lunged toward Helen. Dylan tackled her aside. Paul rolled under a parked sedan and came up on the other side. The bat wasn't enough this time. He grabbed a tire iron from the ground and hurled it at the creature's exposed brain. It stunned it briefly. Brian fired carefully. One perfect shot. Brain matter sprayed across a minivan door. The second licker scrambled toward Deborah. Dylan blasted it mid-leap. The creature slammed against a pillar and twitched violently before collapsing. Silence returned. Mr. Halpern's body hung grotesquely over the hood of a car. Helen closed her eyes. God forgive me. Paul noticed that. Forgive her for what? They didn't have time to ask. Nemesis advances. The lower garage entrance exploded inward. The Nemesis walked through fire again. Rocket launcher discarded now. It drew something else. A massive tentacled arm burst from its mutated shoulder, snapping outward like a living whip. Run! Brian shouted. They sprinted up the final ramp toward the roof level. The Nemesis moved faster than before. It leapt up an entire level in a single bound. Tentacle lashed out. It wrapped around Jonathan's ankle mid-run. He screamed as it dragged him backward. Paul turned instantly. He grabbed Jonathan's wrist. Brian grabbed Paul. Chain of bodies resisting raw force. The Nemesis reeled them in slowly. Jonathan's fingers slipped. Dylan sprinted forward and fired both barrels directly into the tentacle near the base. The flesh exploded apart. The appendage recoiled violently. Jonathan was freed. They ran again. The rooftop exit door slammed behind them. They burst into open air. Night had fully fallen now. The city skyline burned in every direction. The Nemesis burst onto the rooftop seconds later. No rocket, no restraint, just pure pursuit. Paul turned to face it. Dylan grabbed his arm. You can't win that! I don't need to win. Paul sprinted toward the far edge. He looked down. Adjacent building roof, 8 feet across. He turned back. Jump! Brian didn't hesitate. He leapt. Cleared it. Deborah followed. Barely made it. Jonathan stumbled mid-run but jumped anyway. Helen froze. Paul grabbed her and pushed her forward. She screamed but cleared the gap with Dylan pulling her across. The Nemesis stepped to the edge. Paused. Analyzing. It crouched. Jumped. Mid-air. Paul fired the Desert Eagle into its exposed eye. The heavy round struck dead center. The Nemesis jerked sideways mid-leap and crashed into the edge of the building instead of clearing it cleanly. It caught the ledge with one hand. Hanging. Tentacle whipping. Paul didn't hesitate. He grabbed a loose steel rod from rooftop debris and drove it downward into the creature's eye socket with every ounce of strength he had left. The Nemesis roared, lost grip, and fell back into the burning street below. The impact shook both buildings. Silence followed, for now. Paul collapsed onto the rooftop gravel, breathing hard. Dylan stared at him. You're not just a boxer. Paul stared at his shaking hands. Neither are you. Sirens echoed faintly in the distance again. Something larger was happening in the city center. Helen looked toward the north horizon. We need that road. Brian nodded. Then we find a vehicle. Paul stood slowly. The Nemesis wasn't dead. They all knew that. But they had bought time, and time was the only currency left. The rooftop gravel crunched under their boots as they crossed toward the stairwell exit on the far side. Smoke rolled across the skyline. Raccoon City burned like a dying engine. Paul paused at the edge before descending. Down below, in the street where Nemesis had fallen, the crater smoldered. But the body was gone. Of course it was. Not dead, Brian said quietly. No, Paul replied, just angry. They descended into the adjacent building, an abandoned insurance office. The stairwell reeked of smoke and something worse. On the second-floor landing, they found a body slumped against the wall. Office worker, late 20s, bite wound on neck, still breathing. He looked up at them weakly. Please, help! Jonathan froze. Paul crouched, checking the wound. Deep, torn, already discoloring. The man grabbed Paul's wrist. They're everywhere. His body convulsed violently. Brian stepped back. The transformation began fast, jaw snapping, eyes clouding. Paul stood. He didn't hesitate. One clean shot from the Desert Eagle. The man dropped. Helen looked shaken. God, Dylan spoke flatly. That's mercy. They exited through the lobby doors into the street beyond. The dealership. 2 blocks north stood a luxury car dealership with smashed front windows and lights still flickering inside. Paul pointed. We need something big. Durable. They entered carefully. Showroom glass crunched under boots. A salesman's corpse lay draped across a white convertible, intestines spilling across the hood. Behind the glass offices, movement. Zombies in suits. Dylan grinned grimly. Let's shop. Gunfire echoed in tight bursts. Paul cleared left flank with the shotgun. Brian provided controlled cover fire. Deborah moved with more confidence now. Jonathan, despite injury, kept watch behind them. Helen hovered near a steel support beam, trembling but alert. They reached the rear service bay. There, a black Ford Excursion sat near a hydraulic lift. Massive. Fuel tank half full according to dashboard. Paul exhaled. That'll do. As Dylan moved toward it, motorcycle engines roared outside. A dozen bikes skidded into the parking lot. Leather vests, skull patches, broken skulls. Dylan stiffened. One rider removed his helmet, scar across his cheek. Dylan Reed. Dylan didn't smile. Luther. Luther surveyed the group. You ditched the delivery? Dylan's jaw tightened. City's burning. Luther spat. We ain't leaving empty-handed. Paul stepped forward slightly. Not the time. Luther's gaze shifted to him. Who's this? No one you want to fight, Dylan muttered. Luther laughed. Then a zombie burst through the dealership front door and tackled one of the bikers. Chaos erupted. The gang opened fire wildly. More zombies poured in from the street. Paul moved instinctively, smashing skulls with the bat when ammo wasn't necessary. Brian shot 2 clean headshots in succession. Deborah reloaded smoothly. Jonathan grabbed a dropped crowbar and swung viciously. A hunter crashed through the showroom glass mid-fight. It tore one biker clean in half. Luther screamed and emptied his pistol uselessly into its torso. The hunter lunged toward Deborah. Jonathan intercepted, tackling her aside. The claw ripped across his back instead. He screamed, but stayed conscious. Paul fired the shotgun directly into the hunter's face at close range. Brian followed with precise shots. The creature collapsed. Half the bikers were dead. The rest fled immediately. Luther stumbled backward, bleeding from his neck. He looked at Dylan. You picked the wrong side. Then he fell. Dylan stared for a moment, then turned away. They were dead the second they rode into town. He grabbed the keys from the service desk. Helen's secret serving. As they loaded into the Excursion, Helen's purse split open. Bundles of cash spilled onto the concrete. Stacks, rubber-banded. Everyone stared. Brian blinked. You robbed someone? Helen's face crumpled. 20 years, she whispered. I skimmed, little bits. Thought I'd retire quiet. Jonathan laughed bitterly. Guess that didn't work out. Paul stepped between them. Money doesn't matter now. Helen nodded shakily. I know. She gathered only a small bundle back into her purse, left the rest. The city had already taken more than she ever stole. The drive north, the Excursion roared to life. Dylan drove. Paul rode shotgun. Brian navigated using an old paper map from the glove compartment. Deborah and Jonathan sat in the back with Helen. They barreled through side streets, running over zombies when necessary. Paul watched rooftops carefully. The Nemesis would not be finished. They turned onto a wider road leading north. Smoke thickened behind them. And then The sky above downtown flashed briefly. A streak of white rose upward. Brian saw it. What is that? Dylan's grip tightened on the wheel. Missiles. Paul's stomach sank. Sterilization, Helen whispered. They're wiping it out. The sky grew brighter over the city core. They weren't out yet. They were still inside the blast zone. Dylan pressed the accelerator harder. The road narrowed into forest outskirts. Ahead, a sign, Arklay Forest Access Road, 12 miles. And beneath it, a faded marker pointing toward the old Spencer estate. The woods loomed dark and silent. Behind them, the skyline shimmered ominously. Time was running out. Paul looked back one last time. Far down the road, a familiar towering silhouette stepped into the street. Nemesis. Walking, not running, just following. The forest swallowed the headlights. Branches arched overhead, forming a tunnel of skeletal limbs. The Arklay Forest Access Road hadn't been maintained in years. Cracked asphalt, fallen leaves, warning signs half rotted. Dylan kept both hands tight on the wheel. The excursion's engine roared louder than it should have in the quiet woods. Behind them, far in the distance, the skyline of Raccoon City pulsed brighter. Paul kept checking the rearview mirror. Nemesis was no longer visible. That didn't mean anything. First ambush, infected deer. A shape darted across the road. Dylan slammed the brakes. A deer stood directly in the headlights. Except it wasn't right. Its ribcage bulged outward unnaturally. Patches of fur missing. Eyes milky and bleeding. Then 2 more stepped from the trees. Brian swallowed. That's not normal. The first deer charged. Dylan gunned the engine and rammed it head-on. The impact shattered the windshield in a spider web of cracks. The deer didn't die immediately. It clawed at the hood with split hooves, jaw snapping like a predator. Paul leaned out the passenger window and fired the Desert Eagle. The heavy round blew half its skull apart. It slid off the hood. The other 2 attacked the sides of the vehicle, slamming into doors. Jonathan shouted from the back seat as one smashed against his window. Dylan swerved violently. The SUV fishtailed and nearly tipped. Paul grabbed the wheel with one hand and steadied it. "Drive!" Dylan floored it. The remaining deer gave chase briefly before vanishing into the tree line. The windshield was cracked but intact. Deborah's hands trembled. "Animals too?" "Everything that bleeds," Brian muttered. "Minor death. Ranger Collins." They rounded a bend and saw flashing hazard lights ahead. A park ranger truck sat sideways across the road. A man in uniform waved weakly. "Help!" Dylan slowed. Paul scanned the trees. Something felt wrong. They stepped out cautiously. The ranger, Collins, was pale and sweating. "I barricaded the trail station," he said, "but they got through. Behind him, the trees rustled." Paul stepped closer. "Bitten?" Collins didn't answer. He raised his sleeve slowly. Deep bite marks along his forearm. Fresh. His eyes filled with tears. "Please don't let me turn." Silence fell. Jonathan looked away. Deborah covered her mouth. Paul raised the pistol gently. Collins nodded once. "Thank you." One shot. The ranger fell quietly. Helen whispered a prayer. Before they could move, low growls circled from the trees. Wolves, infected. Dozens of eyes reflected in the headlights. Dylan shouted, "In the car!" They barely made it back inside before the wolves charged. The SUV rocked violently as bodies slammed into it. Teeth snapped at the doors. One wolf leapt onto the hood. Paul fired through the cracked windshield. Blood smeared the glass completely. Brian opened the rear window slightly and fired carefully. Jonathan swung the shotgun barrel through the gap and blasted another off the side. Dylan accelerated hard, crushing 2 wolves under the tires. The rest scattered into darkness. Silence returned. Only their breathing filled the cabin. The Spencer Estate Road. A rusted iron sign appeared through the trees. Private property. Spencer Estate. The mansion itself wasn't visible from the road, but the presence felt heavy. Paul glanced toward the dense forest beyond. "Something happened here before," Helen whispered. Brian nodded slowly. "Yeah, something big." They didn't stop. They couldn't. Engine failure. 3 miles deeper. The temperature gauge spiked suddenly. Steam burst from under the hood. Dylan cursed and pulled over. "Radiator's blown. That deer did it." Paul stepped out cautiously. The forest was too quiet again. "Can we fix it?" Deborah asked. Dylan popped the hood. Radiator cracked clean through. "Nope." Helen scanned the tree line nervously. "We're still too close." Brian checked the sky. The glow behind the mountains was intensifying. Paul made the call. "We push it off-road. Hide it. Continue on foot until we find another vehicle." Jonathan stared at him. On foot? In this? Paul locked eyes with him. You want to wait for that thing to catch up? Jonathan shut up. They began pushing the SUV toward a narrow forestry maintenance trail. That's when the ground trembled. Heavy, slow, deliberate. Trees snapped. Deborah's voice shook. Tell me that's not... It stepped into view. Nemesis. But different. Its burned eye socket had sealed over with exposed tissue. The tentacle arm had grown thicker, splitting into two writhing appendages. Its chest cavity had partially regenerated. It had adapted. Paul felt something cold settle in his stomach. It's evolving. Nemesis raised its mutated arm. The tentacles shot forward like spears. One impaled the SUV roof. The other whipped toward them. Jonathan shoved Deborah aside. The tentacle pierced through his side instead. He screamed. Paul lunged forward and grabbed Jonathan's shoulders. Brian fired into the tentacle base repeatedly. Dylan emptied the Glock into Nemesis's torso. The tentacle retracted violently, pulling Jonathan several feet before Paul yanked him free. Blood poured from the wound. Nemesis began advancing. Paul looked at Brian. Take them into the trees. Brian didn't argue. He grabbed Deborah and Helen. Dylan hesitated. Paul locked eyes with him. Move! Dylan grabbed the shotgun and followed Brian. Paul dragged Jonathan behind a fallen log. Jonathan's breathing was ragged. I'm not making it. Paul pressed hard against the wound. Stay with me. Nemesis approached. Close now. Jonathan grabbed Paul's jacket weakly. Tell Deb I wasn't that bad. Paul's throat tightened. He grabbed the Desert Eagle and fired repeatedly into Nemesis's advancing eye socket. The creature flinched but kept moving. Jonathan's breathing slowed. Go, he whispered. Paul looked at him one last time, then stood. He stepped forward instead of back. He fired until the magazine emptied. The heavy rounds finally staggered Nemesis long enough for Paul to retreat into the forest. Behind him, Nemesis roared in fury. Jonathan Karp lay dying on the forest road. Nemesis turned toward him. The chapter ends as the creature raises its claw. Jonathan Karp did not scream when the Nemesis reached him. He was already fading. Blood soaked into the dirt beneath him, steaming faintly in the cool mountain air. His vision blurred, but he saw it clearly. The towering shape blotting out the headlights, the writhing tentacles, the thing that did not tire. Nemesis raised its claw. Jonathan closed his eyes. The claw came down, but not on him. Gunfire cracked through the trees, precise, rapid. The Nemesis staggered half a step as rounds struck the exposed tissue of its eye socket. Paul. He had turned back. He fired while moving, forcing the creature to shift attention. Nemesis pivoted toward him. Jonathan sucked in one last ragged breath. He used the final ounce of strength in his body to roll sideways toward the SUV's leaking fuel. His hand brushed the fallen ranger's flare gun from earlier, knocked loose in the chaos. He understood. With trembling fingers, he fired the flare into the spreading gasoline. The road erupted into a wall of flame. The explosion staggered Nemesis backward into the burning wreckage. Jonathan didn't survive the blast. The fire consumed him and the SUV alike. Paul shielded his face from the heat wave as he retreated into the forest. Behind him, Nemesis howled, not in pain, but in fury. It stepped through the flames, burning, advancing, still alive. Into the Arklay woods, Paul burst through underbrush, lungs burning. Run, he shouted. Brian, Deborah, Dylan, and Helen were already moving uphill along a narrow deer trail. Brian turned when he saw Paul alone. Jonathan? Paul didn't answer. Brian understood. He nodded once and kept moving. The forest terrain turned steep quickly, roots, loose rocks, fallen branches. Gunfire echoed somewhere distant behind them, but louder than that, the sky. A white glow began building over the southern horizon. Brian looked back through the trees. They launched it. Helen whispered, Oh God. The wind shifted suddenly. Warm. Unnatural. Paul grabbed Brian's arm. We need elevation now. They climbed. Branches whipped against their faces. Deborah stumbled once. Dylan hauled her upright without comment. Behind them, Nemesis crashed through trees like an avalanche of muscle and bone. It wasn't walking anymore. It was charging. Minor death. Deputy Hargrove halfway up the ridge. They nearly collided with a deputy sheriff aiming a rifle downhill. Deputy Hargrove looked exhausted, uniform torn. Don't go that way, he shouted. It's everywhere. A tentacle shot through his chest mid-sentence. He looked down at it in disbelief. Then Nemesis stepped from the trees behind him and tore him in half with a casual motion. Deborah screamed. Dylan fired 3 rapid shots into the creature's torso. Nemesis didn't slow. Paul shoved everyone higher up the ridge. Keep moving. The flash. They reached a rocky overlook just as the sky ignited. For a fraction of a second, the forest turned to bone-white daylight. Every tree shadow burned sharp against the ground. The nuclear detonation over Raccoon City bloomed above the horizon like a second sun. Then came the sound, a rolling concussion that shook the mountain beneath them. Brian dropped to one knee. Deborah covered her ears. Helen fell flat against the rock face. Paul dragged them behind a stone outcropping. The shock wave hit seconds later. Trees bent violently. Dead branches snapped and flew like shrapnel. Heat followed, not enough to ignite the forest at this distance, but enough to scorch exposed skin. When it passed, ash began falling between branches like gray snow. Raccoon City was gone, erased. Brian stared at the rising mushroom cloud. "That's it," he whispered. "No," Paul said quietly. He turned. Nemesis had survived the blast wave too. It emerged from the lower ridge, charred but regenerating visibly. The tentacles had fused into a larger, more grotesque mass over its shoulder. It roared, a distorted, inhuman bellow that echoed across the mountain. It was no longer hunting Jill. It was hunting them. Helen's redemption. They ran again, down the opposite side of the ridge now. The terrain grew more uneven. Helen lagged behind, her breathing shallow. She looked down at her purse again, the bundle of stolen money still inside. She stopped suddenly. Brian noticed. "Keep moving." Helen shook her head. "I've spent 20 years taking from people," she said softly. "I'm not dying running." Paul turned just as Nemesis burst through brush 50 yards behind them. Helen stepped into the middle of the narrow trail. She pulled a small bottle of lighter fluid from her purse, camping supplies she'd packed without thinking. She doused herself quickly. Paul realized what she intended. "No!" Helen gave him one small, sad smile. "Go." She ignited herself with a lighter. Flames engulfed her instantly. She ran directly toward Nemesis. The creature swatted her aside easily, but as it did, the fire transferred to its already damaged tissue. The flames clung, burning deeper, slowing regeneration. Paul didn't waste the opening. "Move." They fled downhill while Nemesis roared in renewed fury behind them, briefly distracted by the spreading fire across its mutated shoulder. Helen White died burning, but she bought them distance. Brian steps up. They reached a logging trail cut through the forest. Old tire tracks visible. Brian spotted something ahead. Truck! An abandoned logging truck sat angled off the road, keys still in ignition. Paul looked at him. "You drive." Brian blinked. You're calm. You think ahead. Drive." Brian swallowed and climbed into the driver's seat. Dylan rode shotgun now. Deborah climbed into the back. Paul scanned the tree line as Brian turned the ignition. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life. Nemesis emerged from the trees again, partially aflame, but adapting. It began running. Brian slammed the accelerator. The truck lurched forward down the trail. Nemesis gave chase, faster than before, tentacles lashing. One snapped forward and hooked onto the rear bumper. The truck jerked violently. Paul grabbed the shotgun and leaned out the back window. He fired directly into the tentacle joint. The blast severed part of it. The creature stumbled. Brian didn't slow. The logging road curved sharply downhill and began widening. The trees thinned. The mountains opened ahead. Nemesis slowed finally, not stopping, but no longer gaining. The nuclear cloud towered behind them like a monument to extinction. Paul watched until Nemesis disappeared behind the tree line. For now. The truck continued north beyond the Arclay boundary. Dawn began to creep over the horizon. They had lost Jonathan, Helen, but they were alive. And for the first time since this began, the forest ahead looked quiet. Brian gripped the steering wheel tightly. Paul placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did good." Brian nodded. "We're not stopping." "No," Paul agreed. "We're not." Dawn broke cold and gray over the Arclay ridgeline. The logging truck roared north along a winding gravel descent, tires spitting loose rock into the ravine below. Behind them, the nuclear cloud over Raccoon City rose like a pillar of judgment, widening at the top and blotting out the horizon. No one spoke for a long time. Deborah sat in the back, staring at her blood-streaked hands. Brian drove with rigid focus. Dylan scanned the rearview mirror repeatedly. Paul watched the tree line. Nemesis had fallen behind, but it wasn't gone. Ashfall. As they descended further, ash began drifting through the trees like winter snow. The air grew thicker. Paul coughed. "We need distance." Fast. Brian nodded. The road eventually widened into an old forestry junction. A rusted sign read, Cedar Creek, 18 miles. Small town. Possibly untouched. Possibly not. Dylan glanced at Paul. Fuel's good for maybe 30. Cedar Creek first, Paul decided. Deborah finally spoke. Do you think anyone else made it? Paul thought of Jill, of the apartment hallway, of the roar of Nemesis. I hope so. Cedar Creek, the town appeared mid-morning. Small, 2 gas stations, a diner, hardware store, church, no smoke, no sirens, but no visible movement either. Brian slowed the truck. They rolled cautiously into town center. An old man stepped out of the diner with a shotgun aimed directly at them. Stop the truck! Brian braked. Dylan lifted his hands slowly. Paul stepped out with empty palms visible. We're not infected, the old man squinted. You from the city? Yes. Then you don't stay. Paul exhaled. We just need fuel and water. A woman stepped out behind the old man, middle-aged, resolute. You bring that sickness here. We'll put you down ourselves. Paul nodded. That's fair. After tense minutes, they were allowed limited access to the gas pump and a supply of bottled water. Inside the diner, Paul noticed something. Radio static. Emergency broadcast repeating evacuation warnings. But Cedar Creek hadn't been told about the bomb yet. They were still in ignorance. Brian filled the tank. Deborah sat quietly on the truck tailgate. Dylan lit a cigarette with shaking hands. You ever think, Dylan said quietly, that maybe we were meant to die in that city? Paul shook his head. No. Why not? Because we didn't. Dylan studied him, then crushed the cigarette under his boot. You're not just punching things anymore, Boxer. Paul allowed a faint smile. Neither are you. Warning signs. As they prepared to leave Cedar Creek, the ground trembled faintly. Dylan froze. Paul felt it too, not an earthquake. Footsteps, heavy, measured. The old diner man saw their expressions. What is it? Paul didn't answer. He turned toward the forest line bordering the town. Trees snapped. Birds scattered violently. A massive silhouette emerged between pine trunks. Burned. Mutated further. Nemesis. But no longer fully humanoid. Its torso had split open into a grotesque ribcage structure. The tentacles had multiplied and thickened, forming a mass of writhing muscle over one shoulder. Its lower jaw hung partially detached, exposing layered teeth beneath. It had evolved again. The old man fired first. His shotgun blast barely slowed it. The Nemesis swiped once. The old man's upper body separated from his legs instantly. The diner woman screamed and ran. Nemesis ignored her. It locked onto Paul. It remembered. Get in the truck! Paul yelled. Gunfire erupted from Cedar Creek residents. Brave. Useless. Nemesis charged into town center. Paul fired the Desert Eagle repeatedly into its exposed rib cavity. Brian started the engine. Dylan climbed into the back with the shotgun. Deborah scrambled inside. Nemesis leapt, landing on the truck hood. Brian swerved violently. The creature's claws tore through the windshield frame. Paul grabbed a road flare from the emergency kit in the glove box and ignited it. He shoved it directly into the creature's exposed chest cavity. It roared and recoiled. Brian accelerated hard. The truck slammed into a lamppost. Nemesis lost grip and rolled off into the street. Go! Dylan shouted. They sped out of Cedar Creek as screams echoed behind them. The town would not survive long, but it might survive long enough. Final stretch, the road north widened into state highway beyond the forest line. Sunlight broke through fully now. Blue sky, clean air, no ash. They were beyond primary fallout. Brian finally slowed. Nemesis did not reappear. Paul kept watching the horizon for another hour. Nothing. Dylan leaned back against the seat. He's gone. Paul shook his head slightly. No. But as miles passed and the sun rose higher, the forest behind them remained still. Nemesis had not followed beyond the blast zone. Perhaps its programming had boundaries. Perhaps it had burned too deeply. Perhaps it waited. But for now, they were alive. 6 months later. Spokane, Washington. Rain fell softly against a modest apartment window. Paul stood on a small balcony overlooking quiet streets. Brian sat at a kitchen table studying engineering textbooks. Deborah stood by the sink, hands resting gently on her stomach. She wasn't showing yet. But they knew. Jonathan's final act haunted them both. Dylan worked at a local auto shop now. Legal job. He'd cut ties with Detroit. Paul trained again. Not for fame, not for belts, for strength, for readiness. A small TV in the corner played muted news about congressional hearings into pharmaceutical corruption. Umbrella executives denying everything. Cover-ups already forming. Brian looked up from his book. Think it's over? Paul stared at the distant mountains. No. Deborah stepped beside him on the balcony. But we're not running anymore. Paul nodded slowly. We're not. He glanced at the street below. Ordinary life. Children riding bikes, neighbors arguing about trash bins, no monsters, no firestorms. For now. Paul Winters had lost his career, lost his parents, lost friends. But he had not lost himself. And when the world burned, he had stood his ground.